So let's talk about this new album. It's called Velour, and it came out on the 25th of June of this year through Season of Mist. Let's start with the title. Tell me what Velour stands for, where it comes from, and what it refers to.
Yeah, so Mike has a German background, and Velour basically is German for lost or loss. And so the album, the concept of the entire album basically is about loss, more or less coping with it and the different ways of how we have dealt with it, because pretty much everybody in the group has dealt with some kind of loss, and it's definitely it's one of those things. It's psychological, I guess, for each of us in some way, and I guess it definitely helps us to kind of manifest that through our music, and it helped us create this album for sure.
Now, Dan, this is your first album with the band, right?
Correct.
How involved were you with the writing process?
We all pretty much took a part in it. We all had things to add to it. If you look at it's literally almost every other song. I had my lyrics for every other song, and Mike had his lyrics. So we kind of traded off on that, and so that there was a lot of participation between all of us. Guitar riffs as well. So and Bo, our drummer, he's definitely got his own style, and it's definitely been amazing working with him, because we throw him a riff and he'll come up with 5 different ways of playing drums over it, and we're running from there. Obviously, drums is one of those things that you could say it's not something you write, but I would say that Bo definitely had a big part in the writing process as well.
Now, is Withered the kind of band that writes in the practice room, or do you guys trade riffs back and forth online, or do a couple of members come in with mostly completed songs and the rest of the members add to that?
Typically, what we do is, so say Rafe has a riff and he's really good about this. He has his own recording set up at his house, and he'll record some riffs. Mike will do the same in his house. Mike's got a good recording set up as well as I do. So we all kind of just record individual riffs, and then we'll add it to our, we have basically a little Google Drive of sorts. And when we started writing for Lauren, we just jam-packed that drive full of riffs, and then we would sit down in Mike's house and basically sit there and pick out which riff we wanted to work on first. And then kind of like, okay, say this one sounds good, this whatever's happening at that point, whatever we're drawn to, and then we'll start working from there. So it's interesting because we don't really jam in a practice space when we're working out songs. It's more of like, hey, come up with a riff, record it, and then let's see what we can do with that, and then add it to something else. And it's kind of it's not something I've done before in a previous bands. So this is, for me, it's kind of a new idea, which took getting used to, but it's been really good because we've been able to be very productive that way. Just getting all of the riffs together, having it literally visual for us to see and say, okay, we're going to, and then we named, like we got crazy names for all our riffs. We just come up with goofy names for everything so we can try to remember, okay, do that whatever crazy emperor riff, or I don't know. It'll be something like sludgy or something like that. If I add some sludgy stuff, I'll be like, the cavity riff, I like that one, or stuff like that. So yeah, that's basically our writing process.
Now, with your previous bands, Sons of Tonatai and Leech Milk, What was your preferred way of working? How did you usually write songs?
It was interesting because Tanatia was more or less my baby, something that I kind of created in my mind, and I found the guys to work with. So initially the guys that I was working with, they did contribute music towards the band, but I was the main guy that came up with the songs, the structure and everything, and then we would go from there. So I was pretty much the lead guy directing everything, and which is good and bad. It's like, all right, well, I have all the control, but that's not necessarily what I preferred. I definitely prefer working with people. Leech Milk was pretty much the same way. There was not me, but it was this guy Chris Edmonds, the guitar player of that band. He wrote majority of the songs for that group. When I first started that group, I was just singing. I wasn't playing guitar, even though I knew how to play guitar. I was just doing vocals. So, and then even Chris had his own vocal lines that he wanted me to sing. But eventually with that group, I would add my own things, but it was essentially Chris was the main writer for that group.
We discussed how you ended up joining Withered, but this will also be the first album to feature your bassist. Is it Raffi?
Raffi, yeah.
Raffi. How did Raffi end up joining Withered? How did you guys know him?
Well, so he was in the group before I was. So, and he's been in numerous groups in Atlanta that we all kind of played shows with in different variations. The main group, though, he came from was a band called Sputilator. It was a straight up thrash project, and they were doing pretty well for a while. They were the hot act in Atlanta for a good minute, but then obviously, the band just dissolved at some point, and then I believe Raffi and Mike knew each other probably from the Earl, because that's where Raffi works. He's a bartender there, and that's one of the main clubs in Atlanta that a lot of bands play at. And so there was a lot of that just, who's who kind of thing. And yeah, so I'd have to, you'd have to ask Mike exactly how that all went down. But yeah, Raffi, this is his first album as well, but he had joined, I believe, back in 2016, maybe 2015, something like that, right after Grief Relic, the last album.
Okay. Did you know Raffi from the scene?
Yeah. So Sputilator was something, that I would see often, and I never played shows with them. Tanatia didn't really fit with that, but because we didn't do thrash, but it was definitely something I would go check out for sure. I've seen Sputilator a few times back in the day. And my drummer for Tanatia, my first drummer, ended up playing for Sputilator for a little bit near the end. So there was definitely a member crossover kind of thing.
So you mentioned that you guys had started recording this at the beginning of 2020. But in terms of writing it, when did you guys actually start putting songs together?
Yeah, it's been a while. Probably in 2018 or early 2018 is when we actually started putting riffs and ideas together. So this album is, it's been in the works for a good 2 years before the recording process. So yeah. It was early 2018.
Can you tell me a little bit about what your mindset was going into this album?
Well, yeah, so we kind of laid the groundwork when we discussed ideas as far as, okay, we definitely all kind of had the interest of making it a fluid album as far as having some kind of theme, something to kind of guide us in making it. And so there's lots of discussion about that. Yeah, so when we talked about, I mean, it's kind of a personal thing, I guess. I don't want to get too deep into it, but there's a lot of personal stuff that we dealt with.
In a general way, the album deals with loss, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, I mean, that's the good and bad thing about this kind of music is that it can get dark, and it's obviously heavy, and it's got this morose kind of vibe, and it can be deep, but it's also, for me, it's definitely like when I play it, especially when we're practicing and playing live, it definitely feels like I'm just letting go of all that, and it's therapeutic more or less. But yeah, so it's a challenge though, because like I said, there's good and bad things about it, because it definitely brings up things that you think about, especially when we're writing this stuff and thinking about the past, what has happened, whatnot. It can be trying.
In terms of the music, how would you compare Velour to the previous Withered albums?
Oh, I feel like it's pretty vastly, well, it's a change in direction, and not in a bad way. I mean, it's just I feel like we're evolving into something that's, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just, I can see I can hear the progression all the way from the first album to now, and how things have changed. But obviously, it does have a lot to do with the different members in Withered that have kind of the lineup changes that have occurred in the past, 10, 15 years. It's with the different members, you're going to have different ideas and different concepts that kind of come and go. So with this album, though, I don't know. For me personally, it just feels cohesive. Like, I'm not saying any of the previous albums were not cohesive. It's just this one feels like there's this interesting dynamic of, I don't know, just various concepts that are happening. It's hard to describe though. But like Grief Relic, the last album, I like it a lot. It's one of my favorites for sure, because we definitely play some songs off of that album live. But it's definitely harsher. It's got a weird, crazy, harsh, almost a psychedelic vibe of sorts. It's interesting, and I can't really pinpoint what it is exactly, but it's such a dense kind of album, and it definitely has its own place. But so Velour, I feel like, opens up the doors for more things, more ideas. But I mean, don't get me wrong, I love psychedelic kind of stuff. I mean, we dabble with the delay and bringing in some kind of interesting fluxes, I guess, in the music, if you will. So yeah, I don't know. That's the best way I can describe it.
It sounds to me like a more atmospheric album. Like the emphasis was more on almost the emotional resonance of the album as opposed to specific riffs.
You're talking about Velour?
On Velour, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
You mentioned cavity, having cavity riffs. Lots of this reminds me of some of the later Neurosis albums where there's,
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and especially with the way that you guys do the dual vocals and some of the kind of cryptic lyrics that you guys have.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Neurosis, it goes without saying that we're definitely hardcore fans. That's a band that just has always kind of been on my mind from the first time I ever heard them, which was pretty late in the game. Like I got introduced to Neurosis and the Through Silver and Blood album, which was still, for me personally, was by far my favorite Neurosis album. But it's interesting that group has such an impact in so many different ways. We definitely don't strive to sound like Neurosis, but obviously you're always going to be influenced by things around you, things that you listen to. So
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I'm not sure how old you are. I'm 42 this year. And you mentioned Through Silver and Blood. That's around the time I got into Neurosis as well. And there's still a fairly wide chasm between people who listen to death metal and black metal and people who listen to stuff like Neurosis and Catharsis and stuff like that.
yeah,
But as somebody who always loved all that stuff, all at the same time, it always seemed to me like there was something between like, let's say Fear, Emptiness, Despair era Napalm Death and, Through Silver and Blood and, maybe early Entombed. Like there was like some common ground between all that stuff.
yeah, for sure. I mean, you can hear it with just that. I don't know. Like Neurosis definitely had that crusty kind of element. If you listen to them, it's weird. Like another band that influenced me definitely with Sons Tonatia was Buzz Oven.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that band just fucking, I don't know. They just destroyed my mind when I first listened to them. I was like, what the hell is this? Like, it's just so awful and amazing, just like, damn. It's just the powerfulness of that group was great, at that time. And of course, like I Hate God, stuff like that. It was, again, like, I grew up as a metalhead when I was a kid, but metalhead in the sense of like, Slayer, Megadeth, stuff like that when I was, they're great bands, but I kind of evolved from that as I got older. And then it was my 20s when I first started listening to the more underground stuff. But yeah, I'm definitely happy I got introduced to all that. So it's just mind blowing because there's just so much out there that is pretty untapped and untouched, and a lot of people I feel like don't really recognize. I mean, to me, Withered, even though Withered has done some mega shows, mega tours before, like touring with Morbid Angel and stuff like that, they're still pretty underground, which is another thing that I was drawn to. I didn't want to be, I don't ever want to be in a group that's, out to be commercially successful. I mean, sure, the money sounds great, but yeah, it's not something I'm drawn to. So,
You don't want to be sponsored by Budweiser and play the main stage at like what was that one fest? It was like an energy drink festival. I can't remember. I'm getting old, dude.
Monster, I know what you're talking about, but yeah. I mean, there's so many of these festivals. There are almost a dime a dozen these days. It's like everybody's got a festival going on. But I mean, well, pre-COVID, I guess. Nowadays, it's going to be an interesting playground, more or less, because things are definitely evolving and changing as we speak. So we'll see what happens.